I'm Rebecca Bokiki. I'm Vice President of Instruction, and it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. I just want to take just a step back and reflect on our student panel. And, you know, I'll be honest, I'm a little nervous standing up here and talking to you all. And you've heard our other speakers, you know, talk about that too. And so I just want to really just give a moment to the students who sat up here on this stage and told us to our faces things that are not always easy to hear. That took a tremendous amount of courage and bravery, and I hope that in the conversations we have today, this afternoon, and moving on, that we can show that same bravery. If they can do it, we can certainly do it. And so thank you again to our students. So we've been talking a lot about the two main things that we're focusing on in terms of student success, and that's our Guided Pathways framework and our equity work. And sometimes we talk about those things as though they're separate, but they're really not. They're completely intertwined. Our work over the past couple of years has shown us that our students overall are not succeeding at the rates that they need to succeed, and we need to do better. But we also know that our traditionally underrepresented and underserved students are not succeeding at the same rates as their counterparts, as their peers. And so as we improve success outcomes for all of our students, if we don't close that gap, if we don't reach that goal, we will have failed at an absolutely critical piece of our mission. And so these two things, this work is especially profound for our underrepresented students. And it's not separate from Guided Pathways. They're completely together. They both need to be just part of the air that we breathe as educators. So there's a lot of work for us to do. We've accomplished a lot. We have a long, long way to go. Today's summit is one part of that work. And so with that, it's my real pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. J. Luke Wood. He's a distinguished professor of education and the Associate Vice President of Faculty Diversity and Inclusion at San Diego State University. Dr. Wood is also the co-director of Community College Equity Assessment Lab, which is a national research and practice center that has data collection and training partnerships with over 150 schools, universities, and colleges across the nation. Dr. Wood's research focuses on factors affecting the success of boys and men of color in education. He's delivered, and these statistics are quite impressive, over 750 scholarly and conference presentations, authored over 140 publications, including nearly 70 peer-reviewed journals and 14 books. 14 books. His forthcoming book, Black Minds Matter, Black Minds Pedagogy as a Tool for Civil Resistance, will be released this fall. He's been regularly sought out for his expertise by media outlets such as the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Huffington Post, Fortune Magazine, the LA Times, Miami Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and C-SPAN. During the Obama administration, his research was featured through the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans and the My Brother's Keeper Initiative. He now serves as a National Advisory Board member for RISE for Boys and Men of Color, a research and evaluation initiative of the Executive Alliance. Dr. Wood is a former recipient of the Sally Casanova Predoctoral Fellowship, from which he served as a research fellow at the Stanford Institute for Higher Education Research at Stanford University. He received his PhD in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies with an emphasis in higher education, a master's degree in Curriculum and Instruction in Early Childhood Education from Arizona State University. Also, he holds a master's degree in Higher Education Leadership in Student Affairs and a bachelor's in Black History and Politics from California State University, Sacramento. And I understand that he also is an alum of Sierra College, having taken some classes here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wood.
Good morning. Good morning. How's everyone doing? I'm gonna move these out the way a little bit. So as was said, my name is Luke, and I'm very, very happy to be here today. I guess in terms of a better introduction, I should say that my name is Luke, and that my pronouns are he, him, and his, and that when I saw the land recognition, the Nisenan tribe, and recognizing that, I thought that was a very important way to start off this event. I myself am coming from San Diego State University, and we sit in Kumeyaay land, and we are in processes of figuring out how we can best honor that. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that we are guests in someone else's house. I will say, it's a slight correction, I'm actually not an alum of Sierra College, but I did take classes here at Sierra College, and some very important classes. I graduated from Sac State, as was mentioned, and my experience at Sac State, I came in as a student who was a remedial math student. So developmental education was my pathway into taking college-level courses, and I was terrified of math. I was always saw myself as a real strong writer, and I loved reading. That was my jam, but mathematics, that was something I was scared of. So anything math-related, math or stats, was something that I didn't want to do. And so I took more than a couple classes here, actually a computer science class and a stats class. But the stats class in particular was the very last class that I needed in order to be able to graduate. And so I came in, remedial math student, and then didn't take anything math related and stayed away from it as long as I could until the very last class I needed. And then I came here and I had a really great experience, and I believe I got an A in the class, which if you saw my transcript as an undergraduate, that wasn't something that was common. In fact, most people who know me back then and they hear that I'm a professor now, they say, "Really?" It's like, hey, if I can do it, you can too. But yeah. But in taking that class, it actually opened up my eyes to the fact that, yeah, you know what? If you teach this information right, it's actually pretty exciting. And it was so powerful to me that not only did I fall in love with stats, but it's actually what I teach now at San Diego State. So the title of this presentation is Lifting All Boats Towards Equity for Underserved Students, with the recognition that oftentimes we will say the statement that a rising tide lifts all boats, and hopefully by the end of this conversation you can see how that may not be the best way for us to think about doing this work that's focused on equity. Now, as we begin, I have an important statement for us to consider that I would like for you to reflect upon throughout this presentation, and that is a comment I presented a couple of weeks ago at a university, or community colleges rather, in the Chicago area, and the president there, Lori Suddick, began the conversation on equity by saying, are we prepared to be as uncomfortable as we expect our students to be every day? Are we prepared to be as uncomfortable as we expect our students to be every day? And I thought that framing was important because we can be excited about this work, but the truth is the work, if done right, is a bit uncomfortable. And in fact, many of you may have heard this phrase that when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression by Franklin Leonard. And I think that there's some truth to that. So I am excited that there is such enthusiasm. I'm excited that you have a president who's up here and starting off the conversation. I am a little terrified by following the student panel because they were so awesome. It was like, oh my gosh, what could I say? So I could just end my speech right now by saying everything they said and walking off. But hopefully what I can do is provide some additional context to the insights that they presented to you. I also wanted to thank Stephen for the invitation. We've known each other for some time and have engaged each other in the equity-based circles across the state. And so having the invitation to be able to come here is powerful to me because in many ways, because this is one of the only community college I've taken classes from, it feels a bit like coming home. All right, so with that, let's talk about, if you want my information, Here it is. Again, I'm at San Diego State, and if you want, I don't have the cards with me, so you can take a picture. If not, the PowerPoint is available to you. So I am with the Community College Equity Assessment Lab. We are a research and practice center housed at San Diego State University. And what we do is we partner with community colleges across the country that are interested in improving outcomes for minoritized populations. Our work began with a specific focus on men of color, particularly looking at Black, Latino, Southeast Asian, so Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian, Vietnamese, Native American, and Pacific Islander men. And as we continue to expand and do deeper work on the intersections of different identities, looking at students of different sexual identities, sexual orientations, of different income statuses, first-generation statuses, students experience food and housing insecurities, and looking at those intersections, we realized that a lot of the things that we were talking about, while of course there's some very specific work that is needed to understand the issues that men of color face, that there were some things that we were learning that were applicable to larger populations. So as a result, we ended up expanding our center to really focus on minoritized students with a specific focus on our students of color. So you see that I'm up here and I'm talking and I'll say all these great things, but oftentimes you'll hear me say we statements, and no, I do not think of myself as we. I think of our team as we, and this is just some of the individuals who are on our team. And you can see that we emphasize diversity not only in the work that we do, but also in the people who are putting these ideas and concepts together. So if you think that the information is great that's presented, it's because of this team. If you end up not liking the information, it's because of me. So I will say that some of you may be familiar with a course that I taught last fall called Black Minds Matter. In fact, I ran into a couple of individuals who took the class. If you took the class Black Minds Matter, could you raise your hand? All right, we got one. Maybe the other person left. They're like, I said hi to him, that was all I wanted, but no, we'll see. So I taught a class called Black Minds Matter. And in fact, I was happy to see the young brother up here with the Black Lives Matter shirt. Right? That's important because we believe in our work that black lives and black minds are intertwined, because if you don't value someone's life, then you cannot value their mind. And that's important for us to think about in terms of those connections that we make in the work that we do. So what we did with this class is we basically brought together scholars who do research on black boys and men in education, and then we brought together activists who also do work on these populations, people such as Esley Merritt, who is a Black Lives Matter attorney. We brought in Patrice Kohlers, who co-founded Black Lives Matter. We brought in Ilyasa Shabazz, who is the daughter of Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz, and a whole bunch of people to talk about what do these issues really look like for this population, and more importantly, what can we do about that? That is an online professional development curriculum that lives, if you just go to our webpage, it's free. We have basically there's essentially 10 two-hour sessions that many community colleges and schools use as a professional learning curriculum. Again, I said it's free. So you could go watch the videos. We have discussion questions. We have assignments, different readings that are available. So we have a living curriculum that's online, and again, it's free. So hopefully you'll think about participating in that. We also last year released a report and then followed by a series of reports. The first report was called Get Out, that was focused on black male suspensions. And the county that we highlighted was, one of the counties, I should say, that we highlighted as part of that report was Sacramento County. And also this campus serves students who really come from 4 different counties, and 2 of those 4 counties have very high suspension rates for this population, and that's important for us to keep in mind. In fact, we followed up with a report talking about this area, saying that it is the capital of suspensions. And, you know, there's a lot of honors that we shoot for, but that may not be one of them. Right? We want to be first, right? Except in some areas. So anyways, we have a whole bunch of things that we do around that, but this isn't a black male talk, but I have to at least give homage to the work that we do because it's important, and it's essentially the framework that guides a lot of the sense making that I have around this. And if you're interested in taking the class, again, it's free. You can go to that website, register, and do it as a professional learning community. Oh, well, the slides are free. I mean, not free, but available. I've been saying that too much. No, you can just take a picture if you want. Gosh, I don't look good in that. My hair was not looking righteous that day. All right. We also have online training programs that we do in implicit bias, microaggressions, teaching practices. So if you're interested in any of that, you just can go to our site, which is corelearning.org. Now here, getting to some more of the better information for you. In our work, what we do is, again, we partner with community colleges. We collect survey data, focus on students, looking at their experiences, factors that influence their success, factors that influence equity gaps. We do surveys of faculty, we do surveys of staff, some of that information that you'll see in here. And so we also, in addition to quantitative data, collect qualitative data from students through focus groups. We do the same thing with faculty, staff, and administration. And I'm showing you all this not to say that look at all these nice shiny tools we have, but just to say that when I'm up here and I'm talking, I'm not just saying things because they sound good. These are things that are based and rooted in research, rigorous research that's been done by myself and many of my colleagues in our shop, our research shop, as well as throughout the country, that have come to some pretty clear conclusions about what it takes for us to move forward equity agendas in climates of resistance. And when we talk about climates of resistance, sometimes the resistance is within the institution. Sometimes the resistance is within the local community. And there's also, of course, resistance that takes place at the national level, but that's a conversation for a different day. We also have a consortium that we operate called the National Consortium on College Men of Color. We have 130 community colleges that participate. We took a small hiatus for a little bit, but one of the things I want to point out is that you all are part of the consortium, and we're one of the first institutions to join. We'll have our working group that will basically restart the consortium's operations taking place in June. So if anybody wants to come down to San Diego and spend a few days talking with us about equity, we'd love for you to do so. But if you haven't participated in any of the sessions, essentially it's a professional development consortium. Just go to our website. We have a whole bunch of different webinars. We've done over 30 of them focused on different topics: teaching, learning, counseling, advising, designing support practices, assessment, embedding mentoring programs, early alert systems, all kinds of different topics as it relates to how we can support some of our most minoritized students, particularly our men of color. And these are just some of the examples of that. All right, now to the meat. What do we believe? Doing all this work, collecting all this data, what do we believe? Well, we believe that equity is imperative to student success. And a lot of individuals feel much more comfortable talking about equality. Let's do the same thing for every group. But what we oftentimes find that is there are certain groups that experience disproportionate impact. And you have some just amazing data tools that your campus has been using and putting together, showing groups that are experiencing disproportionate impact in terms of different outcomes, whether it's persistence, course completion, basic skills completion, experiences on campus, retention. And what you find is that there are some students who are experiencing and succeeding at on this campus at great levels, and there are students who are falling below the bar. And our goal with our efforts is to be intentional about addressing where the gaps are and supporting student success. And so we believe that equity refers to a heightened focus on groups that experience this disproportionate impact, and then us engaging in actions to remediate disparities in those outcomes. Now, sometimes when people look at the data that many of you have probably had a chance to look at, and if you haven't, please go to your website, because your equity team has put together some great information. But sometimes when people see that, it's easy for us to immediately go to blaming students, blaming families, and blaming their communities. And sometimes it's in the very direct ways where people say, oh, students are lazy, they don't care, they don't belong here. And sometimes it's more in the subtle ways where we say, well, you know, they come from bad communities, or the schools that they come from just aren't as good, which is really just code for some of the same kinds of sense making. So it's easy for us to say, you know, what the heck is wrong with these students? Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful here? And we have to think about what are the outgrowths of that kind of sense making. Well, we're going to create programs that are designed to fix students, to remediate students. And sometimes those programs are necessary for addressing some of the issues that students face, but so often we're focused on fixing students and remediating students that we're not as equally attentive to fixing and remediating ourselves as educators. So one of the things that we learned early on in doing this work is that most educators were never really prepared to teach the students who are in their classrooms. And we can talk about that from a lot of different levels. But let's go into this, right? Many of us were never actually taught how to teach. So I am a faculty member in a college of education, and my space is in really kind of two areas: early childhood, hide my ECE folks out there, and then higher ed, right? And I basically, everything in between I don't really touch, which is funny. But I haven't really been, had the intentional people teaching me, okay, this is how you do things. I mean, I've learned a lot of theory, which is nice. And think about it, I'm in a college of ed, so what does it look like for some of the other folks? What we know is that, in general, we are subject matter experts. We became faculty members, say, in biology. We went and got a bachelor's degree in biology, went in industry for a few years, got a master's degree in biology, and then what happened? We went into the classroom. And then we had to figure it out. And maybe we got some really quick professional development training. This is what you do real quick, maybe a 2-week training program. Some folks have something that's a little bit longer than that, and maybe nothing. It depends upon the college you go to. And so what do? We think about, who was that good professor that I had before? And then what we try to do is emulate it. And so typically what we do is we teach how we were taught. And how we are taught is typically not how our underserved students learn. Why? Because it oftentimes does not focus on relational strategies that are imperative to building the kind of trust and respect that's necessary to support their success. So we think that a better way of making sense of what we need to be doing is saying, what are we doing or not doing as a college or as a unit that results in our students of color not doing as well as they should? And when we start to think about things from this perspective, then we're not thinking about building programs to fix and remediate students, but building programs to build our capacity to serve those students and to be student ready. And that's important for us to keep in mind in this work. If you've seen me present before, you've seen me present this slide, and I'm going to continue to present it because it's a really good way of making sense of what occurs. This is a quote that's attributed to W. Edward Deming and Paul Batalden, and it says that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So, if we have disparities in outcomes and disparities in experiences, what do we need to change? Do we need to change the outcomes or the system? The system, right? And by changing the system, then it changes the outcomes. But if we're so focused on, they have gaps in these areas, what do we do about it, right? Then we're not really starting in the right place by thinking about what's within our control as educators to do. We have to also recognize that we all have the ability to be successful in doing this work. In fact, the students up here gave examples of great work that's being done by many educators on this campus. They also give examples of some pretty significant pitfalls that we have to think about as well. But we have the capacity to do this. And the very fact that you are here, present, engaged, suggests that there is a commitment to doing so. The fact that you are out front on this work and creating equity-based initiatives and have a president up here saying this is important, just so you know, that doesn't happen in every place. And here's what's been really interesting and eye-opening in doing this work. When I go to other states and they hear about all the stuff that we are doing, they're envious. The entire country is watching right now what is taking place in California and saying, how can we do what they're doing? So guess what? We can't mess it up. Because everybody's watching. It's very important for us to keep that in mind. We can't mess it up. So what are we finding? Well, in our work, we think that there are a lot of things that influence student success. And this is our sociological outcomes model. As researchers, we have theories, of course, that undergird how we approach our data collection, data analysis, and sense making. And basically, this theory says that we have inputs in terms of students, right? Students have different ages, time status, veteran status, all kinds of different, varying levels of abilities. And then there are societal factors that we know are very present and even more present than they've ever been, or maybe we're just more willing to acknowledge it. And those factors influence 5 primary domains that influence student success. Non-cognitive factors, such as their confidence in their academic abilities, their perceptions of the usefulness of college. Identities. Oftentimes in our work, we're looking at identities through the lens of sexual orientation, sexual identities, and we're looking at the lens of gender identities, particularly with our work on men of color, and recognizing that there's some specific things that we're talking about men that influence success. We are attentive to the fact that there are things in the academic domain that are important, such as whether or not students are engaging with us, and more importantly, whether we're engaging with them. We're going to get to that point. Environmental domain, factors that occur outside of college that influence students' lives inside of college. The campus ethos domain, that's the climate and culture that we create. I'll go ahead and give you one important piece of information that we learned from all of this, is that when we model what predicts a student's success, and we take those background factors, right, the things that people like to point to, or the environmental pressures, food insecurity, housing insecurity, stressful life events, employment conditions, all those things that it's very easy to point to say, this is what's wrong, and we model those things on success, they are predictive. They certainly do tell us a bit about whether or not a student's going to be successful. But what we also find is that campus ethos domain, whether or not students feel like they belong, whether they feel like they're welcome to engage with us, whether they receive validation, that accounts for 3 to 4 times the variance in predicting their success. Said differently, we have more power in what we do than oftentimes all the things that we point to in terms of what actually leads to a student being successful or not at this institution. That's important because that's good news. That's good news, that we have the power to change the outcome gaps that we see. So, what are just some basic things that we think are important with this? Well, we can't talk about what to do and practices without talking about perceptions. And let me give you a reason why I always start with perceptions first. Because there are stereotypes that influence the ways that we engage. In fact, let me tell you this. When we first began to work, the most common thing that would happen, particularly in our work on how do you teach men of color in community colleges, is we go to a college and they say, hey, can you give us like a 1-page sheet that we can give out to folks on what to do? Just some bulleted items on how they can teach our men of color. And at first, my colleague Frank and I, we put together like a sheet, and then we never gave it to anyone. And the reason we never gave it to anyone is because we realized that, you know what, if you tell people just practices, you can arm them to do more damage than good. Let me give you a great example of what that looked like. One of the colleges that we were working with, Frank had went and done a session talking about college men masculinities and talking about the importance of recognizing that sometimes men are apprehensive to seek out help because they have been socialized to perceive it as a sign of weakness. And so it was a very important conversation, very illuminating to some of the people in the room. It was a flex day, so Frank did that conversation. I was there just being like, echoing a couple points here and there, tying in some intersectional points as how that also can relate to racial identities. And then after that, a faculty member then went to a different session on building relationships outside the classroom. And the person in that session said, hey, when you see a student, engage them. And that's important because one of the things that came out of the conversation earlier and was that, that you can see people and not necessarily engage them. I think it was Duha who said that, right? That you can see people, and if you don't take the time to say hello and to engage them, then that can create a certain type of environment. In fact, one of the things that we found early on, one of the first studies that we did on men of color, was that when they would see their faculty members outside the classroom, that the faculty members would put their head down, walk the other direction, pretend to get on the phone, and you just heard confirmation from somebody else that, hey, we're not crazy, that happens, right? So that's important. And I'm going to come back to that point here in a second. But so this faculty member was trained. Go engage students outside the class. So they went to a session, again, first on masculinity, second on engaging students. And this is a faculty member who is well-intended. And that's where a lot of the challenges come in place because we have to separate intent from impact. because you can have good intentions and still have a negative impact. So what happened was this faculty member, real excited, progressive faculty member, cared about students, wants to change the world, gets out and says, you know what, the first person I see, I'm going to go and engage them. Walks out of their flex session, sees a black male student, first student they see, they're like, oh, there's one. Walks over to them, says, hi, I'm so-and-so, I teach here. I hear that you guys have problems asking for help. So what I'd like to do is build a relationship with you. So, what sport do you play? Yes, a series of microaggressions. And here's the thing, this faculty member had good intentions. Their heart was in the right place, but if you haven't done the deeper work of thinking about how we have our tacit assumptions and implicit biases that the students were talking about, then you will only be armed to do more damage than good. And you might be saying, how did you learn about this? I learned about it from the student. And the student came up and says, hey, you're the one of those people who does all that training with our faculty. Can I tell you something that happened? Now, this student has since transferred. I don't think it had anything to do with that, but they had transferred, but they had told me about this experience and how they had said that, I was so glad that the faculty member said this to me and not to somebody else, because this was a student who recognized that the faculty member wanted to do the right thing but didn't necessarily have the tools for doing so, and so this student became the faculty member's mentor. So what occurred is that this student would meet periodically with a faculty member and give them tips on how to engage with students. So sometimes we think of faculty-student mentoring, but we really need to be thinking about student-faculty mentoring, but that's a whole other thing. All right, coming back to one more point before I go to this. Remember how I said that in one of my earlier studies, we found that faculty members would walk the other direction, pretend to get on the phone, to avoid interacting with students. And a lot of times when we go and we talk to campuses, they're like, really? No, that doesn't take place. And then we collect data with their students, and we show them that this occurs on your campus, and they still have a hard time of believing that. But it's true, and that's how implicit bias works, is oftentimes you're not aware of the things that occur. But in that same study, we then did a follow-up question to students and said, you know what? Who do you have relationships with outside the classroom? And what we expected to hear is that they were going to say counseling faculty. But we heard something different. They said, the person who encourages me, who tells me, I'm proud of you, keep your head in the books, keep going strong, I'm here for you, it's the janitor, the custodian, the food service workers, the groundskeepers. So if any individual from that designation is in the audience, if you could stand for a moment. Anyone here? No, I know they were invited. I was hoping they might be here. Because all right. Okay. So what I would recommend is this. The beauty of what happened today is that before the keynote speech took place is that there was a student panel. Usually it's the keynote speech and then a student panel, but you prioritize putting students first. Maybe next time, then after the student panel, there can be a panel with our janitors, custodians, food service workers, and groundskeepers, so they can tell us about building relationships. Okay, so common microaggressions that we see that are experienced by students. 4 big ones. And there's a ton of them, but these are the 4 biggest ones that we see that are most recurrent in our work. One is inscription of intelligence, where we may assume that some students are academically inferior, that we've been taught throughout our lives to see certain communities as having higher levels of intelligence and other communities as having lower levels of intelligence. And so when we see a student in our classrooms, in our offices, we oftentimes will have tacit assumptions about what they are capable of doing, and that influences the advice they get in terms of what programs they should enroll in. It affects the ways that other students engage them in the classroom. it affects the first day of school. In fact, oftentimes we will say that the first day of school is when usually the most microaggressions occur. And you might be saying, well, why is that? Well, on the first day of school, you'll have students looking for classes. And again, we have to separate intent from impact, where you'll have faculty members with good intentions. They want to make sure that students are in the right places. And so if I'm teaching a calculus class and a student walks in and, this doesn't look like a student I've had in my class before, I would say to them, this is calculus. Are you sure you're in the right place? And I'm giving calculus as an example, but we find that with a lot of different classes that then students are given these messages, these helpful messages, right? The intent is to help, but the impact is harm because it suggests that I didn't think that you belonged in this space. And then students go, and then we do these things where we say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to, in your classroom, we're going to break up into groups of 3 or 4. I'm going to get this assignment ready, and then we're going to come back and do this assignment together. And then what happens is students break up into the groups of 3 or 4. Anyone ever done that in class before, where they break students up into groups? Okay, all right, I'm the only one. So, right? And then what happens is what we find from our students, particularly from minoritized groups, they tell us that they are the last to be picked, or in many cases, they're not picked at all. Or if they are picked, it's with a sense of reluctance, with an eye roll, or body language that suggested that other students didn't want to work with them. So those are some things that we see about ascription of intelligence. In fact, I learned about it most early on in actually one of the earlier studies that we did, where we were looking at students who are in the classroom. We were asking them, what affects your success? And many of the students, and this was a study that was focused on men of color, said, I don't really engage in the classroom. And oftentimes you'll hear people use the word disengagement. Don't use that word because that's typically not what's occurring. It's typically more of an apprehension to engage. And there's some good reasons for that. And we can, as someone who does ECE work, we can, it starts in ECE and it continues throughout. But what we found in that earlier study is that students would say that, sometimes a faculty member, they'll go over some information and then they'll ask if someone has the answer to something. And I'll know the answer, but I won't say anything. And sometimes they'll have gone over a complex model and I don't totally get it all. And they'll say, with good intent, does anyone have any questions? And then really, I'll know that I have questions, but again, I won't say anything. And sometimes they'll say, I really want to support you. If you need some support, come and see me during my office hours, and I'll know that I need to go, but I won't go. And of course, as a researcher, our big question is always, why? And they'll say, because they'll think I'm dumb. They'll think I'm ignorant. They'll think I'm stupid. And again, those aren't messages that came from nowhere. They're messages that we tacitly and unconsciously communicate to our students. And those are messages that are reaffirmed throughout the matriculation process and by other students. It happens all the time. So you should assume that a student who is in your class has overcome immense barriers and is the most resilient student you have if they're from a minoritized group, because that's what it took for them to even be there. Assumptions of criminality is another big one that we see, where we have these assumptions that students are dangerous, deviant, up to no good. All right? And this is something that, again, begins as a message that students receive in early childhood education, and it continues until they get to our community colleges. And it's communicated in very overt ways. We oftentimes will hear campus police will, be asking students for their IDs, or students are being accused of cheating when they haven't cheated, and all kinds of different things. But that usually occurs in more subtle ways. And one of the ways that we talk about frequently is what's called the step back. And a step back is when, let's say that this is my class, and my class has ended, and let's just say that, I'm a real good professor and the students really like to engage me. So I got, midterms coming up, students have assignments, students just want to come talk to me. So students are coming at me from all different angles, and I see let's say a dark-skinned Latino male coming up to me in my periphery of view. And I catch just a bit of a glance of him. And my unconscious mind tells me to step back, just a little bit. So slightly that typically none of the other students around me notice. And maybe I don't even fully step back. Maybe I just shift my body language a bit. And then I think to myself, wait a second, We just did that whole equity thing. I'm on board with equity. What am I going to do? You know what? I'm going to say, I'm sorry for microaggressing you. No, that's typically not what we say. Typically, we do what other human beings would do, which is we try to cover it up. And we pretend like it didn't happen. So we step forward, put our hands in affirming posture, smile real big, say something nice to them, hoping that it will cover up what just occurred. But in reality, it only serves to further reinforce that that's exactly what just occurred. And what we believe in the work that we do is you cannot teach, you cannot counsel, you cannot advise someone who you fear, because it will mar all the micro-level interactions that you have with them. Another one that we see is pathologizing culture, where we assume that students, their values, their communication styles are lesser than. And in fact, one of the big ways in which we see this manifest is those they statements. They're lazy. They don't care. The one that we hear most often is, well, they're just here for the financial aid. Or they'll be gone by census. You'd be surprised how many people will tell that in an individual interview. And we think that that kind of sense-making is not what it takes for creating the conditions that we need for students to be successful. And so we have to think about our students differently. And the last one you'll see up here is athletic boundedness. But you can probably guess what that one is. So you would be surprised how often I've been mistaken for a professional athlete. And at first I used to think it was a compliment, but then as I started to gain more weight and get more and more out of shape, I started to think to myself, gosh, this team must be sorry.